Hey, Margaret.
Hi, Jasmine.
How's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Looks like you got in okay. That's always good to see.
I know. Fingers crossed for John and Bob here.
I know. I synced up, I think, with John earlier already to make sure he's all set. So he should be okay. I think he's joining via iPad. Hey, John, how's it going?
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yes, you're
Oh,
all good.
good, good.
Let me ask you a
I
question.
was
Is there any way you can get your computer higher up as much as you're
higher up.
looking at the giant? Yeah, there we go. It was just a little bit of this view of you. Like maybe you're on a roller
Okay.
coaster. That's
Is
perfect.
that better?
Beautiful.
I have to tell you, this 5 minute warning has been the biggest piece of anxiety. I was just like, oh my God, you can't get on and make sure it works until 5 minutes.
Wouldn't it be a Propelify with a little last minute anxiety, right? We want to infuse that live events feel,
Yeah. So speaking of which, how do I present?
Little camera, like not camera, like computer looking icon at the bottom of your
Oh,
screen.
yeah. Here we go.
It should give you options for your entire screen, application window, or Chrome tab. Which that's a long list for me. I have way too many tabs open, and you should do it. If you want to give it a test right now, we can see how it goes.
Okay, let's see. Because I'm going to do both the PowerPoint and the polling.
Cool.
Okay, so you should see yourselves right now.
And let me ask you, when I click this, do you guys see it full sized, or is it?
Yep.
You do.
Well, I'm sorry. No, I saw your clicker, but that is, you see PowerPoint there.
But do you
not
see
the
it
presentation
as
mode.
bigger? Do you see this PowerPoint as more of the screen with us at the bottom, or is that just my personal view?
It's just one of the quadrants on the screen.
So what we'll do is when you hover over it, it should say click twice to maximize video. So we can just share with people that if they want to double click on that, they can see it a little bit larger in their screen. Like if you guys give that a try.
Oh yeah.
You see that?
So if I click twice and then it becomes bigger. Yeah. But I think you just need to go into presentation mode when you do it, Mark.
Yeah.
So there you go. Perfect. I think you have to toggle one other time.
Does that work?
That's the presenter view.
Yeah, there we go.
There you go. Beautiful. That's what you want.
Beautiful. And so we are recording this. Okay. It's only going to be available to me, so we can decide after the fact. And by the way, I can also cut it. So if you're like, the first 30 minutes, we really want to turn into a great content piece and lesson, we can do that, or we can do the whole thing. And honestly, we might decide it's easier to do just a piece of it to leverage into a shorter bit of content. And again, we have till 3:30. You can weave in questions, you can do Q&A at the end, you can do it however way feels organic to you to engage the audience. And I'll be here leveraging chat, kind of chiming in on people, calling people out whenever I can, and getting people to engage.
Yeah, that's great. So we have some stuff in here to try to get people focused at the beginning. We have a little icebreaker, and then we have some polling throughout. And then, but we're happy to make it conversational.
Awesome, cool. Originally I was sort of it's a panel and then it's discussion, but the people that are listening in here, I think a few people are starting to trickle in, might want to comment on what you're talking about at that time. So do you want me to try to moderate in stuff I'm seeing in the chat, or do you see that session chat as well on the side?
Let me see. Actually, Bob's just calling me. 1 second.
Yeah, Bob said he's in the current session.
So he might have logged in differently. All he has to do is request to share video and audio, and we can add him in if he hears us. And definitely feel free, there is a mute option on this to mute when you're not talking if you want. It might just also help reduce any echoes or confusion. I see Bob just entered the session. So Bob, if you're there and you want to hit request video and audio or share video and audio, we can add you into the feed here on screen. I see John just popped in too. So
Okay.
there's
Did John get in?
I see John just popped in the session, and Johnny just has to request share audio.
I'll hang up here.
Okay, bye.
Bob, looking good. How are you?
Hey, Bob.
Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
Perfect.
Good morning, everybody, or afternoon. I should say it's after lunch your time, huh?
It is. Where are you?
I am in beautiful Burlingame, California, right near the San Francisco airport, where we have no air conditioning in our houses. How's that?
Oh, jeez.
That's good.
Uh-oh.
Good, just because it's so beautiful where you are right now, whereas it looks like it's going to rain in New Jersey. You're just rubbing it in.
New Jersey is the Garden State.
It's true. It's on our license. Well, thank you all for joining. I just want to turn things over to Don, but real quick, want to say thank you to Ernst & Young for sponsoring this CFO forum where we talk about anything and everything that's interesting to the financial world and leveraging their expertise to do so. I'm Jasmine Hoffman. I'm the head of experience at Tech United. I will be in the background of the chat here and keeping pretty silent unless I can help anyone with any technical problems. What I want to just recommend is please leverage the chat. This is meant to be an interactive session, and this is an awesome opportunity to ask questions to these incredible leaders here, engage with your fellow attendees, talk all about environmental, social, and governance issues and reporting and initiatives. So please make sure you're active in that chat. I will start calling people out. Without further ado, I will turn it right. And Don knows this. He's seen me do it before. I will just start calling on people. If you don't want to come on video, you can send me your question and I'll ask it for you. But we want to encourage people to feel like they can pop on, engage with everyone here, and have a great discussion. So without any further notice, Don, turn it over to you. Thanks for putting it together.
Thank you, Jasmine, and good afternoon to all the participants today. As Jasmine mentioned, my name is Don Bucciarelli. I'm an assurance partner with EY in our Island, New Jersey office and a board member at Tech United. EY, we're really excited to participate in this year's Propelify event focused on better future for all and today's theme, which is better planet. So I think this is a great topic. And we're proud to host today's CFO forum, which is focused on environmental, social, and governance reporting matters, which continues to be a top agenda item for many companies and their boards. Joining me today to lead the session are John DeRose and Margaret Widener from our Climate Change and Sustainability Services team, CCAS for short since it's a mouthful. And we also have a special guest, Bob Hirth, who's a board member and co-vice chair of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB. And for those of you joining us today who are new to ESG reporting, the mission of SASB is to establish and improve industry-specific disclosure standards across financially material, environmental, social, and governance topics that facilitate communication between companies and investors about decision useful information. So I think simply put, we've all realized in the financial world that there's a real tie-in between ESG initiatives and financial relevant financial impacts, and it's good to see these things coming together. As Jasmine mentioned, we really encourage all of you guys to actively engage with us by asking questions using the chat feature, or we can have you guys join live to ask your questions. So with that, John, Margaret, Bob, thank you guys for joining and welcome. I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves, and I'll turn the session over to you guys.
Great, thanks, Jasmine and Don. Margaret, maybe we can start sharing the screen and we can just go to the agenda. Don did a pretty good job introducing me. I'll just say that I'm a CPA by trade, but I've been working in the sustainability field for the past 15 years. I lead our non-financial reporting services within the US for EY, and I also work closely with various standard setting bodies, as well as participate on some task forces with the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. So as we'll talk about today, the growing aggregation of reporting standards and the alignment of non-financial reporting and financial reporting clearly needs to have the profession involved from a CPA perspective, as well as appropriate standards set behind it. So we'll get into more of that, and I'll turn it over to Margaret and then Bob, and then we can get into some polling questions.
Great, thanks, John. So I'm Margaret Widener. I am a manager in our climate change sustainability practice. I also have an accounting and auditing background, but I've moved my focus over to sustainability, and I've been working in this environment for about 4 to 5 years now. And I mostly work with companies on reporting non-financial information, so from greenhouse gas emissions to water consumption, and more so in this time frame around the social metrics as well. I also have a background in helping companies manage their risks related to environmental, social, and governance issues. And so we'll talk about this more here today.
Great, thank you, and hello, everybody. My LinkedIn profile is up to date, but briefly, I was a audit and advisory partner at Arthur Andersen in 4 different offices, including one outside of the U.S. I then got involved in forming the consulting firm called Protivity. From 2013 to 2018, I was the chairman of COSO. So some of you I know love and hate COSO. This was the time period when the internal control framework was revised and is used mostly for Sarbanes-Oxley reporting. And then during my tenure, we also released the revised enterprise risk management framework. And just at the very tail end of my work, I actually worked with Margaret on a publication that's available for free on the COSO website, coso.org, that talks about how do you take these ESG factors and mesh them in with the company's enterprise risk management activities. And then in 2017, I began to get involved with the SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And you can go to sasb.org and find out all you want to know about SASB. But we have a 9-member standard setting board. Think of it a lot like the FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board. And the 9 of us oversee the actual ESG standard setting process for SASB, which is based upon an industry orientation. So I'm pleased to be here and look forward to your questions and also having all of us tell you a little bit more about this important topic.
Margaret, maybe we jump into the polling questions, the initial polling questions, and you can give us just a quick idea of how to use the Menti tool while we go through this.
I think we'll start with the icebreaker first before we get into the polling. And we included this here just to get everyone to feel engaged. We know that the current environment and being virtual all the time is very difficult, and to stay engaged in a number of different sessions you may be a part of today is sometimes challenging. So we thought we would do this exercise first. So if you have a piece of paper or can pull up a Word document, go for it. Jasmine has hers right there. So if you can just spend a minute before we get started, write down anything that you have on the top of your mind that maybe it's on your to-do list that you don't want to forget before the end of the session, or anything that comes up, just write it down here quickly. Okay. Next step, now rip it up, delete it, put it on your to-do list, and forget about it for the next hour and a half or so. And we want everyone to be engaged as part of this workshop. So feel free to ask your questions as we go. As we mentioned, we've got some polling throughout. So let's get started with that here. So we're going to use Menti if you're familiar. So on your phone or on your computer, if you can go to www.menti.com. Here at the top of the screen, and use the code here that's up top. You can enter that and you can start rating your knowledge of ESG matters before we start this session.
And this will be good, as we mentioned, this will be interactive, and we want to see your questions come in, and we want to hear you speak up. But these polling questions also help maybe jog your memory or help you think of other attributes of ESG that you want to ask a question about as we go through the discussion here today.
Yep, so this will come straight on screen. All right, we're starting to get them in here. people recognize they're novice in this space, which is totally fine. Some more confidence in where you are, advanced beginner, some feeling competent, which is great. And so we think the content we have here is for everyone. So we'll be able to talk to issues and topics you may know more about than you think. So let's go here to the next one. Okay. So then what topics come to mind when you're thinking about ESG reporting? So you can type anything here. Yeah, I think you can type up to 3 different things.
And Margaret, you're going to have to help me here when we see some words come up. So that I got my glasses as close to the screen as I can get.
All right.
To be able to
And if you don't know, you can type "don't know." That's fine as well.
You can also double click Margaret's screen share, and that should allow everyone to see it at about much fuller size on their screen.
So as we're waiting for that to come up, I do see a question that came in while we're chatting, and we can touch on this a little further in the presentation as well. But there's just a quick question about what percentage of companies are actively developing or publishing ESG metrics. And I think it depends on how you slice the data. One of the stats we hear a lot are, if you look at the S&P 500, obviously that's a select group, but I think it's around 94 to 96% of those companies actually issue some sort of ESG disclosures or sustainability report.
Oops. Okay, so we got some responses here. So we hear people saying transparency, efficiency, regulation, incongruent. That's a good one, and that is something we'll cover here today. Confusing, another topic we will cover here today. Investments, global sustainability, what to report, science. These are all good topics. So thanks everyone for your input here. So John, I'm going to pass it back to you to get us level set it here on ESG.
Yeah, perfect.
And John,
so, yeah, please
John, if I can just
coming in, and we'll try to. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, John, if I can jump in. It seemed like we may have had another question. Rachel, if we can bring Rachel in to ask her question, we can jump right to that and then get into it.
I saw that Rachel requested to share her video to ask a question earlier. Rachel, if you're still listening, you want to request it again, we can bring you on screen. If not, we can circle back.
Okay,
Rachel, she's good. You might have already asked it.
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, great.
Okay. So, I think from our polling question, we had a lot of folks who were advanced beginners. And I think, as we go through the discussion here, let's ask questions. We can dive down into some details. But what I want to start out with is where we are today and how ESG has become foundational to, a good strategy to managing the business and governing the business. You'll hear, and I think we saw in some of the word cloud earlier, that ESG could be used in different terms. You can have CSR, sustainability, corporate responsibility, and there's been a lot of terminology over the years. What seems to be circling upon right now is just thinking about ESG in the context of non-financial reporting and sustainability. And when you start to think about reporting on different metrics related to ESG, some of the examples that are kind of table stakes or included in most, if not all, of the standards are listed here on the slide. But what's important is the evolution of this disclosures. And if you look at the top part of this slide, as we go back decades to why companies initially started to report ESG or sustainability information, it was largely driven by NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and through philanthropic efforts, if you will. And then the standards started to solidify and more companies started to report. And if we fast forward to today, and I will say those of you who are the advanced beginners are probably in a good position today. There's been a lot of sausage making process, if you will, over the past 2 decades as far as what does it mean to issue sustainability information or put it out in a report. And, I can go back to the Global Reporting Initiative, which is a standard setting body around these metrics. And they hold a conference every year, or every 3 years, they had a conference in Amsterdam. And I remember going back to the first one in the early 2000s that I went to. And certain companies would win the awards for best reports because their reports were 200 something pages long and they were disclosing a lot of information to appease a broad base of stakeholders. And there were, butterflies and children dancing all throughout the reports. In today's day and age, ESG reporting or non-financial reporting is viewed more of a fiduciary duty. There's more linkages between providing ESG information into the marketplace and investors and asset managers and other sophisticated stakeholders who are directing the flow of capital in the marketplace using ESG information like they would use financial information in their decision making. So I think it's important to think about this information in the same context as your balance sheet, P&L, statement of cash flows, knowing that it's immature state or infancy, if you will, but the ultimate goal is to think about that from a business management, a disclosure, and a risk perspective moving forward.
Hey, John, just a couple comments on this. If you think about the two topics of risk and value, think about the financial statements and the 10K. You're looking at, what are the risks of the organization? The risk factors are in there that are financially related. You're looking at EBITDA and the, days sales outstanding and levels of inventory. And a lot of those are risk related, but you're using all that to figure out the value of the organization. So as we now move over to this, I'll call it other information, it's not just always non-financial, is how does the company use natural resources? What natural resources does it use? What are those in short supply? What if the price of that resource went up exponentially? Is the organization a large emitter of carbon? Are they operating in countries where there might be regulation related to that? So you begin to see all those things in terms of risks, but then also in terms of value. If a company is now moving their packaging to a different form of non-fossil fuel, or they found a way to address some incentives with employees and they're retaining them more, then there's the view, well, the company is doing things that maybe makes it more valuable. So if we took 2 companies, one of which is doing those things and one which is not, the investor now says, from a value creation perspective, I really want to know about those things because it makes a difference in how I want to value that company. So these other activities and other sets of information are becoming important into what are the risks of the organization faces, and then how would I value it?
Excellent. Thanks, Bob. And Margaret, if we want to go to the next slide, I think, we'll touch a bit on, some of the drivers or catalysts in the marketplace as well. And this next slide focuses on, the disclosures and transparency being driven by investors and asset managers. And, if you hang around the same water coolers I do, and even if you've just flipped through Wall Street Journal or other publications, you've probably heard about BlackRock and State Street and other asset managers driving for the reporting and disclosure of this information, as well as how they're using this information in constructing their portfolio, managing risk, making decisions about investments or not investing. So, as I mentioned, those of you who are advanced beginners in getting into this or a little bit down the road, it's a good time to actually make sure you're setting up your program appropriately, because you're able to kind of leapfrog the noise of the past couple of decades, as I mentioned, but you're also keenly able to focus in on specific asks from key stakeholders where in the past you may not have had that luxury. We also have a bit of stats up here from EY does a survey of asset managers every year, and I think we're in our 5th or 6th year. But things have changed even from 2018 to 2020 as far as the asset managers having a formal process for evaluating ESG disclosures in their decision-making process. It's increased from 32% to 72%, which is, in my mind, a huge jump, and it shows that these types of disclosures and managing this type of information is becoming table stakes if you're looking to attract capital in the future. And last point I'll add, and we'll get into standards a little more, is beyond the standards for reporting out on information like the Global Reporting Initiative or the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, you'll hear us say, is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We'll get into that a little more in a few slides. But that's also that's also seen as a catalyst in the marketplace, where investors and asset managers are really trying to understand the risk of an organization based upon modeling and scenario analysis around climate change outlooks. So I see a question coming in, and we can flip to the next slide, but I'll read the question here just so I have it. Do we think the results of November election will impact ESG reporting, guidance, and other requirements in the future? I can take a first pass at that, and I'll ask Margaret or Bob to weigh in. My view is it will probably accelerate this type of disclosure and management, and may put a bit, if it goes one way, and may put a bit more regulatory pressure behind this type of disclosures and management. However, up to now, at least in the US, there's been a bit of a void of that type of regulation and guidance. And the market has still moved significantly, and I will say significantly in the past 18 months probably, because certain stakeholders, as I mentioned, like investors and asset managers, are driving for this type of transparency. They're driving companies to set the governance in place to manage this. They want to manage the risk. They want to capitalize on the opportunity. So the market's going to move forward regardless. It just may be accelerated and more regulated, in my opinion, if the election goes, one way or the other. Bob or Margaret, I don't know if you want to add in anything.
Yeah, John, I completely agree. There could be some changes. For example, the Investment Advisory Committee at the SEC came up with some very specific and prescriptive recommendations, which were voted down under the current configuration of the SEC. So as you said, if there's a change in the election, that could accelerate that. But you brought up the right point. What's really important here is the market is driving this. And in fact, I think the SEC likes that. They're not having to make many rules, but they're seeing more disclosures and more reporting. So now that the money has gotten involved, a la BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street and others, including the banks, I don't want to say that it doesn't matter, but the market is really moving this forward without any specific regulations. But to your point, yeah, it could accelerate if we get into a higher regulatory environment. But as you said, it's going to keep moving forward regardless.
Great, thank you. So, in that context, as accelerators or catalysts in the marketplace, the Business Roundtable back in August of 2019 kind of redefined the purpose of the corporation, from focusing on just shareholders to focusing on a broader base of stakeholders. And this is important, in and of itself, it's a big move. But when you take it as a marketplace as a whole, with everything we talked about already and what we'll discuss throughout this chat today, it's just another piece in the puzzle as far as leadership and governance structure at organizations recognizing that you can't run your organization without considering these types of the broader base of stakeholders and these environmental, social, and governance metrics, and managing them appropriately. Simply, if you look at some of the attributes, and whether you're a large or small company, you'll see that if your company's managing to these types of metrics and disclosing them, you're going to have the ability to attract top talent. You're going to build customer loyalty. You're going to be able to attract capital, and all of the competitive advantage that Bob mentioned earlier, or avoidance of risk, is going to be in your governance purview, and you're going to be managing to that. So I see, I guess we could flip to the next slide and I'll read the next question as well that's come in, and we can try to address it. To what extent do you credit this trend to younger consumers, investors entering the ecosystem versus truly a change in mindset of corporate leadership reaching a maturity level that they recognize that stakeholders beyond shareholders as key to attracting both talent, loyalty, and investment dollars?
John, let me sort of take that. There is, when we think about this, the myriad of stakeholders, one big group of stakeholders is employees. And so there's a viewpoint that there are generations of employees that are more interested in this than others. And I say that's partially true. But I think that what we're finding in the work that I'm doing at SASB is everybody's interested in this. It's not just one group. But then go back. It's, if you pick on the millennials, you can say they're emerging investors. They're a small piece of what's already invested. And I think it's those more mature and even older investors now that are getting focused on this. One thing that you each can make a note of, there's actually a mutual fund that cherry picks the S&P 500. We all know that as an index that's been pretty successful, but now S&P has an ESG 500. So what they've done is they've taken those 500 companies and they've graded them out in terms of their, what I'll call their ESG performance, and created a smaller than 500 group of companies they call the S&P ESG 500. So if you look that up, the performance has been equal to or better than the 500 index. So I think that it's not just millennials, though they're interested. So for those of you that are hiring new people, I think those of you that can tell a story about ESG might find you're more successful than a company that doesn't tell its story about ESG, if you want to think about that one slice of stakeholders in the employee group.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. And I think, this next slide, kind of reinforces, the value of considering ESG metrics. Back in the day of the first housing, the housing crisis back in 2007 through 2009, we saw companies begin to report and pull together teams and FTEs and have investment in further refining their ESG programs, whether it's from a management perspective or reporting perspective. And those programs didn't diminish during that recession or downturn. Likewise, there's been plenty of research out of Harvard and other places that show how ESG investments or ESG funds are outperforming the market. And another litmus test that has come upon us all is the pandemic and what's happened in the marketplace since March. And there's been studies that show that the ESG funds and ESG companies are still outperforming the market even in a pandemic. So, it's not that this is pie in the sky. If you really drive down into these metrics, even if you're not reporting, you'll realize that you may already be tracking this information and managing this information, because in most cases, it's material to your organization in some manner. And then in areas where you're not, maybe you're not calculating greenhouse gas emissions or a specific quantitative metric related to some sort of consumption, you'll realize, as Bob mentioned, once you start to track it and manage it, you may be able to avoid risk or recognize value or save costs. So, I think these kind of go hand in hand as far as the increasing value of an organization or outperforming the market when you just have better management and governance in place over more aspects of your business.
Yeah, John, I might just give an example of a client I had recently where it really gets to the point of where you need to start measuring it, where you may not have in the past. So I've been working with a client. They started thinking about ESG when ISS, one of the ratings agencies, approached them and said, you need to be reporting on this. And so they started putting something together and started collecting this information across their different manufacturing operations and aggregating it. And then this past, last month, I think it was, we got into the actual part where they were calculating and measuring their greenhouse gas emissions. So they had been looking at some of the utility consumption they had been measuring from the past year, but they were finally measuring their greenhouse gas emissions. And it really helped them see that there was one particular plant that was dwarfing all of their other emissions in other locations, and it was really due to the grid. And so it helped them identify, hey, this is really where we need to focus, and this is where we need to make our changes and focus on, maybe we can invest in renewable energy in this location, and it would make a pretty large difference. So, but prior to that, they didn't have that information to know, this is the significant impact we could be making based on our own operations as a starting point.
That's great. Thanks, Margaret. And maybe as we flip to the next slide, I can read the question that came up. How is this responsibility being driven at the board level in light of the lack of diversity on many boards? And then can we obtain a copy of the presentation? So yeah, we'll work with the team on the second part of that question. But the first part of that question, what we're seeing at the board level is there needs to be governance in place at the board level. As I mentioned, if you think about to that first slide where this type of reporting and management of these types of metrics may have started out as a philanthropic exercise, or the reporting may have been handled by marketing and communications, we're seeing now, because of the sophistication of the users, because the information actually being used to direct the flow of capital, etc., much of this reporting structure and governance flows up through the finance function and to the board. And the board needs to have oversight, because many companies are actually tying these metrics into their overall strategy and objectives, as well as setting operational type goals around these types of metrics. And those goals actually impact share price, shareholder value, and the broader stakeholders we talked about. So before I jump into some of the contents of the slide here, I wanted to see if Margaret or Bob had anything to add about the board structure and what you're seeing on the ground.
Yeah, John, I think that if you think about the order, I think about how would you get started. One is first have a discussion among yourselves. And at some point, as you all know, you got to get the board engaged and support. So think about that. But there are some other references for each of you. All of the accounting firms and, of course, EY have got publications out that will address some of the board responsibilities. But there's a NACD guide that came out recently. The NASDAQ has some guidance information as well for boards. A number of the law firms have addressed this from a governance and liability perspective. And, John talked about tying this in. The other place where it's tying in, where the board gets involved with the nominating or the compensation committee, is some companies now are creating a nexus between these ESG goals and the incentive compensation of certain members of the management group at the company. So it's key. You can't be successful without it. But I'd also like to make the point: the board's role is a role of oversight, not of management. So the board, not that they're going to not do something, but it's the organization that needs to do the work. And then the board, of course, should be asking the right questions and then getting the right flow of information to, in their view, oversee what's going on, to see that it's meeting the objectives of the organization, doing what needs to be done to satisfy the shareholders, which have been a primary stakeholder, but also these other stakeholders that John has mentioned.
Yeah, and I'll add, as I mentioned, the ownership of this, we used to see a lot in the marketing communications. Marketing communications is still important, as well as legal, investor relations, SEC reporting, etc., because all this information ties together, and it's not sustainability and ESG metrics being reported in a silo for a very niche market or set of stakeholders. It's actually embedded throughout the organization. And if you were to ask companies if they've had discussions through their investor relations, more and more you'll hear that on every call they talk about ESG metrics, which brings us to, what does it mean? What's the risk of disclosures? And again, some of these stats on this slide here tie back to that survey I mentioned earlier. And what we see holistically from that survey is asset managers and investors want comparable, reliable information, and they want some sort of external assurance over it, because they are making financial decisions based on what you're putting out in the public domain. So you have to start thinking about, what are you talking about in your sustainability report or website or somewhere, whether it's about climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, material risks around climate change, etc. And then what are you putting in your Ks or other financial statements that may not mention that? There needs to be alignment between this information because it's being used by the same sophisticated stakeholders. So it takes the holistic governance of this information to make sure it's aligned with all of the other messaging and reporting going out from the organization to actually articulate the same story, the same level of value to your broad base of stakeholders.
John, one thing that we're seeing, we talked about this morning on our prep call, is some of you, when you hear the word 10K, you say, well, that doesn't apply to me. Okay, fine. Well, let's take you as a private company. In many cases, private companies have some form of borrowing or credit they're getting from banks. So what you're clearly beginning to see now is banks in their credit analysis adding in a set of ESG items in their evaluation. So those are things like, we're going to renew a loan or make a loan to an organization. How many facilities does it have? Real quickly, how many of them are below sea level? Are there any regulatory actions against this group for emissions standards? What do they, admit? Do they have any, labor related issues? This is an organization now that has visitors. To your point about COVID, what have they done about employee safety? So for those of you that aren't public, you're seeing that this is becoming an issue in part of the funding that you may receive or not receive from a bank, including there are actually what are called ESG linked loans. Organizations that create some ESG goals and targets may receive a lower interest rate if they meet those targets. So there's a base rate that gets set up, and then there's some ESG goals that get set. To the extent those are met or exceeded, there's a formula for the interest rate to go down.
And having said that, Bob, based upon your experience, how has SASB addressed market and investor needs, whether it's large companies or small companies? I think that's a good transition into our next section here.
Yeah, well, SASB is an interesting organization. I like to call ourselves the meat in the sandwich. On one hand, we have the investors, and remember, the investors will always want more information. They have an insatiable appetite. If you ask them if they would like to know what the CEO had for breakfast today, they would say, yes, we want to know that. On the other side, there are the reporters, and sometimes I call them the victims. And so we have to be careful that, this hand wants everything. This group, they want to provide that, but they also want to be careful. They don't want to provide, too much. So SASB is trying to, work both of these things out. And I think something that we're proud of as a standard setter, we really engage both parties significantly. But we did start out trying to listen to investors, realizing that the information that was being reported was ad hoc, was different, was not comparable. So a couple of things on SASB. Number one, we start up with, does this matter? Is this particular item, likely to be financially material? So how would it impact the financial information? Materiality is in the eye of the beholder in some ways. There's a legal definition of it for public companies. So we start with that. So we want to cut out, all of the noise and really begin to focus on the things that, have the biggest impact. Then decision useful. So the idea is, okay, investors, if you get this information, if we determined together it was probably likely to be material, what are you going to do with it when you get it? What decision are you going to make? And if you can't tell us that, then we have to question why we're even reporting the information. Cost effective, we don't go through a real detailed analysis right now on the hours to pull something together, but we do ask that question when we work on, this hand. Remember the companies, how would you get that information? What's that going to take? One thing that we do is we look at, are there already some industry association reporting requirements? And if there are, we try to use those to the extent we can so that it's already reported. So one view would be, there would be little cost. I think one of the most important things we do is this next point, that we're a industry specific organized set of standards. We've grouped the world into 11 sectors that total 77 industries. You can go to the SASB website. You can look at what's called a materiality map, which begins to say, what are those likely to be material items by industry? You can put in your ticker symbol or the ticker symbol of a company or the name of a company and see what industry you map to, and then you can download the standards for free. So as you can imagine, an airline and an oil and gas company and a retailer and a tobacco company and a software company, what's material to them on ESG is very different, including the issues are different. Waste management, water management, use of energy, those, child labor, those apply and don't apply. So that's, we think, one of the most important things. We have a whole evidence-based process. In fact, right now, our rules of procedure and conceptual framework have been revised slightly, and they're out for public comment, so you can look at those. But we really try to take a objective approach to gathering evidence as to this is important. And the market informed comment is really, we're continually asking the investors, what they want, what's changing. We've got an agenda of topics that we're going through right now. So that's a little bit about SASB. And again, there's a lot more at SASB.org. There's application guidance. John mentioned the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosure, TCFD, part of the alphabet soup, as we call it. There's a implementation guide for that. Again, when you find your specific industry standards, which could be just one industry or multiple industries, there's a nice table that shows you the specific metrics, and then below that there's some technical protocol as to how would you calculate that. So that's a little bit about SASB to answer your question, John.
Yeah, perfect. And I'll add, to that, as far as the reporting and cost effectiveness of SASB, we deal with companies of all sizes and all level of maturity as far as reporting or starting to report. And I mentioned that SASB does help sometimes cut through the noise or leapfrog, as I like to say, in finding these sector-specific metrics that are material to you to report out on. But it's important to also remember that this isn't a once and done. Right, these metrics are going to need some FTE to actually own the reporting and do that on an annual basis. So you need to set up the controls and processes and develop the FTE and have the FTEs develop the processes to do this year in and year out. So don't think of it as very daunting, but know going in that this is like producing your financial statements, and the goal overall maturity level is to actually get that information out in an accurate, comparative, timely manner over every year.
And John, as you mentioned, there's a lot of different stakeholders. Of course, one stakeholder is the investor, and we'll probably talk today about the alphabet soup of standards and frameworks. And I think where SASB is landing in this multi-framework situation is we are being seen as the investor preferred framework. You've alluded to BlackRock, and then we could add Vanguard and State Street. They all have specifically mentioned and endorsed the SASB standards using the words industry specific. And part of that is when we get back to the decision useful, there clearly are some qualitative descriptions in the standards, please explain how you address this or how you do this. But a big part of what SASB's done different perhaps than some of the other frameworks is, what are the numbers that can be produced that an investor can use back on that decision useful? So I said we've become the investor preferred framework. And I guess when we look at the question of what companies are reporting and how many are reporting, what we've seen just in the last year is more companies now, unfortunately, are producing reports on one or more frameworks. There was a question, and John, you talked about it. More than 90% of the S&P 500 report some form of CSR ESG report. That's the good news. The bad news is some form, so it does different. And for those of you that want another reference, there's a great report that details all that reporting from a group called the G&A Institute. That stands for Governance and Accountability Institute. It's quite a good report. It shows percentage of the S&P 500 that get assurance, that use this framework or that framework. Now, I've asked G&A, what about 500 to 1,000? And I've not got an answer yet, but I hope that they'll look at that. And my view would be clearly, Fortune 500 or S&P 501 to 1,000, there's less than 90%.
And we did have a question come in, Margaret, if you want to go to the next slide while we tee up this next question. So the question was, remote work opened many corporates' eyes to the cost of operating an office and the secondary costs of pollution and resource use to travel to and from the office. How did this play into ESG reporting and evaluation? For example, for the companies that decide to permanently work from home. From my perspective and with our clients, I think, and even here at EY, I think we're recognizing that the large corporate footprints may be changing. We recognize that the technology is here to still interact with our clients, to still get work done. And maybe you don't have to travel across the country for an hour meeting because you value the face-to-face time. Everybody does. But I think it also allows people to recognize that maybe we were a little excessive in the amount of getting to the office or getting on an airplane. I think it will definitely impact the metrics that are reported, and we'll see all sorts of different spikes. We'll see probably a drop in certain types of emissions if you're not traveling. But from what I understand, companies may be running their air conditioning units and cycling more air through better filters. So your electricity costs may be up during a pandemic just because you're trying to filter air. So if your electricity costs go up, then your emissions from that particular source of energy are going to increase as well. So there will be some fluctuations that we see at our clients related to those disclosures as well.
And John, that could be, to your points, I mean, this could be temporary or it could be permanently baked in. I know, for example, Ernst & Young had set a carbon neutrality goal or for the end of 2020. And I know they video I saw, they had announced they had actually already met their goal. And the reason why they met their goal in the current year was this huge decrease in air travel. Now, along with Ernst & Young, most of the other accounting firms and some law firms have also announced their carbon neutral goals. Some have actually met the goal because of that. Some say it's contributing to that. But the bigger point for everyone to think about is, and Brian Moynihan at the Bank of America is really trying to push all companies to set some type of carbon neutrality goal. And certainly COVID has contributed to getting closer to the goal. But then your point is right. Going forward, what do you think about? Do you have to have all that travel? And most of the firms have said they don't think they need to do that.
Yep. Although I think a lot of people want to just get out of the house, so we're willing to travel anywhere at this point. Bob, do you want to talk a bit about some of the use of the standards and the adoption and where you think SASB alone may be going or seeing the trends?
Sure. So just first of all, a little bit of history to this. SASB was an organization formed in about 2011. A lady, PhD engineer named Jean Rogers started that. She started looking at these ESG factors from an investor perspective and quickly learned that the reporting's all over the board. It's very different. Michael Bloomberg was interested in this topic as well. He gave Jean a desk at Bloomberg in New York, and she began to study this and developed a board. And in maybe 2012 through 2016 or so, she began to develop some standards, quickly saw that it needed to be by industry. And then we had some provisional standards out there for a while that some companies used. But the real stake in the ground for SASB was in November of 2018 when we launched our formal, final, approved and codified standards, approved by the standard setting board that I'm on. And then we, of course, had been measuring, but began to measure how many companies formally use the SASB standards and report all of them, how many report some of the SASB standards, some of them because they give a reason why they don't report them all. Sometimes they don't give a reason. And then what companies say they were informed by the SASB standards or they use them, and you can kind of see that they report some of them, but they don't characterize them as SASB, or they say they considered SASB and report something different. So you begin to see here the increase in the number of users, formal reporters, mentions, et cetera. And it's really gone up exponentially. So go back to that timing. November 2018, 80% of public companies or most companies have a December 31 year end. They may or may not have been tracking that. So you have to say there wasn't going to be any 18 reporting or in 2019. So we've really seen now that they've been out for a while, that companies have really taken hold. And one of the measurements we have is the S&P Global 1200. That's something like 80 to 90% of the global market cap. So we're really tracking that. So we've seen a really significant increase. As I've said, We have a lot of investor endorsement. We've seemingly become the investor preferred framework. Maybe we'll talk about the rest of the alphabet soup. So, we're pleased that we've seen this uptake, and we expect it to continue. I think, again, we'll get to this, the confusion or the change can be, which standards end up being, here when we're done with all this convergence, which ones go away, et cetera. But again, SASB.org gives you a lot of those statistics, and we actually have some reports that show you which companies report against the standards by industry on the website.
And I always find this amazing because that purple line, or the light purple line, just keeps growing this year, and I suspect, as you mentioned, it's going to continually grow. And as I mentioned earlier, it's all these different pieces that are falling in line in the marketplace that are, bringing this to a head, if you will. While there's still items to be sorted out as far as standards and where it sits and everything else, it continually comes to the forefront that this is something that can't be ignored. Address it, build the processes and controls, build the right team and governance structure, et cetera.
Yeah, and not to simplify it, John, Larry thinks BlackRock's letter is pretty specific. It's, we want you to report the industry-specific SASB standards by the end of the year and the TCFD disclosures or some kind of equivalent. Now, remember, that's the public companies. Let's go back to those of you that are not at public companies. We talked about it again this morning. Some of you are with non-public companies, and you may even be a smaller company, but you may have a big customer, or you may have a customer that is a public company. So what you're seeing at that level is these larger companies are pushing down these ESG factors, the interest, even some of the metric reporting to their suppliers. So as a smaller private company that might have a big company customer, don't be surprised if someday that big company, big customer starts to ask you about certain ESG related factors, like where do you get your raw materials? What sort of labor do you use? Where are your factories? Did you get those factories certified to a third-party audit with respect to child labor? What is the waste or water management of those supplier factories as well?
That's great. And Bob, it looks like we have another question that came in, and I think it would be a good one for you, given the international role of SASB. The question was about how other countries outside of the U.S., are they ahead or behind of the U.S.?
Yeah, well, we think they're ahead for a couple reasons. One is there's some more significant regulatory regimes. Some of the stock exchanges have mandated a form of reporting. They don't talk about the framework, but they require a company to report. There's a European Union non-financial directive about certain information needing to be reported by companies with a comply or explain issue. There's also a view that just the geography or the environment of Europe, for example, people being closer together, all those things, it's a little tighter sort of situation that they've been more concerned about this. So I think the regulatory environment, the impact of governments, just some of the philosophies have driven those organizations. Also, John mentioned this organization, GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. This is what we call a broad all stakeholder framework. It covers a lot of things that a lot of stakeholders would be interested in. That organization is headquartered in Amsterdam, so accordingly, it has a big influence in the European community. But now you're seeing the Hong Kong Stock Exchange has some very, very prescriptive requirements on every public company completing an ESG report, and it's down to the to the individual words of what they need to say, including the board's role. So yeah, I think they're ahead, and what SASB's trying to do is, of course, monitor both of those. We got started in the U.S., but we think an industry is an industry wherever it is you're working. So we think that our metrics and our standards apply regardless of where you're located. But yeah, I'd say outside the U.S., especially Europe, is probably a bit further ahead than the U.S. But go back to John's point, 90+% of the S&P 500 have some form of report. And as you know, many of those companies like Toyota, et cetera, are headquartered outside of the U.S., but they're on a U.S. stock exchange.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Margaret, maybe we go to the last side here, and then we can jump into some risk discussion.
Yeah, so John, this is just really an example of the momentum we've seen about people supporting us. We have actually a investor advisory group. There's $40+ trillion of assets under management that we work with those companies. The thought of that group is they become members because they are supportive of the SASB standards. And if they don't like something, they should tell us, and we'll do our research to see what needs to be revised. But we also have people that have just joined. We have a group called Alliance members. Just, I don't want to say random people, but people that want to be a part of this and get information ahead of time. So they do that. And then, because if you think about, the standards are a form of intellectual property, whether it's ISS or different asset managers, many people are taking our standards and driving them into their models, or putting them in a software application for people to use, or even a way that, we've populated all the SASB standards. So here's a way you can quickly get to them, and then, put your reporting in some sort of tool. So I think the really nice thing to see is we're getting a lot of support. We're not the end all be all of frameworks, but again, we've got a very specific, like I said, focus on the stakeholder that's the investor. We've tried to eliminate the things that don't matter. We want to make sure that what is reported is used by investors and not just, nice to have. We recognize the industry differences, and that's critically important. We don't want to reinvent the wheel if someone else is reporting those things, and so on. And I think, so far we've gotten good feedback. And again, what we are really interested in is the complaints. If you don't like something, we want to hear about it. We have got a contact us button. So go to SASB.org and hit it. And we'd love to hear the negatives.
Thanks, Bob. And I think, as we move on, Steve brought up a point in the chat about the positive environmental benefits of reducing corporate footprints and commuting, as we talked about earlier, may negatively impact the social and economic benefits of cities and communities where these businesses reside. And I think that's true. There's probably going to be some winners and losers just due to the pandemic alone. But if we think about climate change and climate risk, which Margaret's going to jump into here shortly, there's also going to be winners and losers there. And it's anticipated that there's probably more opportunity to be a winner if you think ahead and plan accordingly. And I know, Margaret, you can take us through some of the risk considerations that you've worked on for so many years.
Great, thanks, John. But before we do that, we'll go back to another polling. So we'll go to the next poll. So go back to your Menti. It's there. And the question is, when you're thinking about ESG risks, what's top of mind for you? So what types of ESG risks come to mind? All right. Here we go. They're starting to come up here. So deforestation, absolutely. Clean water, climate change, negative publicity, compliance and disclosure. All right, we'll see a couple more come up. So what this next section is on is how companies are starting to realize that these ESG risks are very important. So setting the stage here, over the past decade, we've really seen the ESG risks rise in terms of importance. And every year, the World Economic Forum produces this global risk report, which they survey business and government, civil societies, and other thought leaders, and to understand really what are the highest rated risks in terms of impact and likelihood. And over the last decade, those risks have shifted significantly. So back in 2010, only one societal risk, which interestingly was pandemics, chronic disease, was reported in terms in the top 5 in terms of impact. But in 2020, we see that all of the top 5 risks were environmental, and that includes extreme weather events, natural disasters, and failure of climate change mitigation, biodiversity loss, and even human-made environmental disasters. So I think this relates back to the point that was just brought up in the chat. But part of this report and looking at these risks is identifying that there's increasing interconnectedness among ESG risks themselves, and also the risks in other categories. So how do these environmental risks or water crises impact social issues such as involuntary migration? And so in the business world, this is very much an evolving landscape in which these ESG risks that were once considered those black swans are much more common and are manifesting much more quickly and significantly.
And Margaret, I might add, everyone, this is really a great document that comes out every single year. So again, you might make a little note: World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. It's really well done, and it doesn't apply, every part doesn't apply to you, but it gives you a good sort of step back. What's sort of happening, what do the world leaders think are the big issues, and whether that becomes something that applies to you or maybe creates a business opportunity. It's really good to look at. I think John, a little bit later here today, will talk about a publication that the WEF, as we call it, has come out with, that the accounting firms have authored. So again, great source of material for all of you.
Yeah, and I will add before
Yes,
Margaret
absolutely.
jumps to the next slide, just in relation to some of the chat going on, how do you make big steps? And clearly the biggest steps would be made from government and regulation. And as we already talked about, whether that happens or not, what we're seeing at our clients is they're starting to, obviously they're reporting and they're setting goals, and they're trying to figure out ways to mitigate their impact, right? Whether it's reducing their emissions or going carbon neutral like EY did. But they're also starting to push initiatives into their value chain. So they're making demands of customers, as Bob mentioned, and they're going as far as to having their customers set goals and prove that they're reporting against certain standards or setting goals against certain frameworks. So this collaboration, or this pushing through the value chain, is going to drive a lot of changes. And hopefully, there's the consumer side of it, and we always think we can go out and shop with a knitted bag instead of the plastic bags. All that stuff helps, but the biggest leaps are the changes we make as business leaders, and then how you push those changes into the value chain. Sorry, Margaret, please go ahead.
Right. Yep, thanks. So, we think about this and we think about what do these risks cause, and they actually are causing very much risk and disruption to businesses. And so it could be from an operational perspective, as part of putting together some guidance on how companies can integrate these ESG risks into their risk management processes. We met with an organization who had experienced extreme flooding, and it was in Chennai, India, a few years back. Some of you may remember, and it wiped out their ability to even get anyone into the office. They had large data centers there. Things were in the basement. They couldn't run their operations. And so they, as part of that, went back and said, let's do a postmortem and understand what could we have done better based on that event. And so these examples of how they're looking at these events that we're seeing, it could be from your company, it could be from examples of other companies and what has happened to them, and trying to identify, what could we have done differently, is really part of that thinking that is risk management. And so a lot of these examples, you see in the news every day, can be really useful in kind of brainstorming and scenario planning for your own company to understand how to integrate ESG into your own risk management practices.
And
so
these aren't
one of the. Go
sorry,
ahead, John. It looks like you're my talk.
Yeah, just to add, these examples aren't just what happens everywhere else in the world. We may see it, water shortages or typhoons, and we see other countries being impacted by this. I mean, think about Hurricane Sandy, and I know I have clients on the Gulf Coast who have been hit by 2 500-year storms within the span of like 6 years. So do you rebuild? Can you get insurance? How do you start to look ahead and manage and consider these risks? This is real stuff that's happening, at home here.
And John, just to remind everybody again that it's free. So at COSO.org, we have this publication that talks about how do you take these ESG factors and begin to knit them into your ERM program. So it's a broad starting point, but I encourage all of you to just take a look at that.
Great. And part of why we came up with this framework was because a lot of these ESG risks are often very significant to businesses, but they're difficult to manage. And a lot of companies or organizations think that these risks may be longer term and have a difficulty quantifying and understanding what is the impact today to impact my decision making so that I'm better positioned to manage this in the future. And so climate change is one significant example of that, where we recognize that greenhouse gas emissions are going to cause further warming of the planet. There's going to be large economic and social consequences, but that exact timing and severity of the impacts to your own business can be difficult to estimate. So as Bob mentioned, we put together this framework that really goes into the process of how do you take processes that you may already be doing as part of your risk management activities and apply them to these ESG risks, which may be viewed as longer term or maybe not significant right now. And how do you kind of walk those back to how it matters today? And so we see that when we talk about risk, we're not just talking about the negative impacts. And so this is very much around the risk side and how to mitigate losses, but it's also from an opportunity side. And so, for example, here we've got, the financial services industry has 2.1 trillion potential gains from capitalizing on shifts related to climate-friendly services. And so this gets back to different products and products they're able to offer, whether it's green bonds or sustainable bonds, those sustainability-linked bonds that Bob mentioned earlier, and really linking the flow of capital to these positive initiatives for ESG.
Yeah, I think it's important to note as you go to your next slide, Margaret, that that example is just the financial services industry. But if any industry can be, obviously you want to manage the risk, but if you're forward looking and thinking about the shift in everything from dynamics of climate change to consumer sentiment to opportunities to fill new roles that are emerging or may not exist yet due to climate change and due to managing social risk, et cetera, there is opportunity for growth and to create value for your organization.
Great. And so we're definitely seeing that COVID-19 has been a good example and can draw a lot of parallels with climate change. A lot of things about it are really those intangible risks that make it difficult to see, but we're recognizing those economic and social and environmental consequences of what's happening. And so, it's taking that greater appreciation for these global systemic risks and identifying how it's impacting companies, but also identifying where there's opportunities for the company to better manage these risks longer term.
And Margaret, just keep me honest. I didn't see one of the questions that you saw. So if you do see something else pop up, or Don, just let me know. But I don't know if my system's a little behind. So feel free to ask questions as we go through.
Okay, great. And so when we talk about those opportunities, we're seeing, particularly, there was a report that came out that showed that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals offer an opportunity that's $12 trillion per year for business to build a better world and to focus on creating both these low carbon solutions, but also looking at the societal implications through job creation and other activities. And so we see this play out with different companies, and particularly with our clients who are seizing on these opportunities from the current environment and looking for ways to, whether it's engage and focus on circular economy initiatives where they're trying to eliminate waste in their existing supply chains or create more recyclable products. biodegradable products, so that we can eliminate waste as part of that. And so there's a lot of really interesting and innovative ideas that we're seeing in this space, and we expect to see that accelerate over the next few years. So, and just the last thing we've got here is the framework that we've mentioned. It's designed to link to COSO's overall enterprise risk management framework, and it aligns to these 5 different components that are part of that framework, and really start at the governance and culture for managing ESG related risks, looking at how a company integrates ESG into its culture and values, and then go into the strategy and objective setting, thinking about how ESG is linked back to the company's overall value creation model, and then going through that process of identifying ESG risks and not doing those necessarily in a silo, but doing those as part of your mainstream risk management activities. One of the things John brought up at the beginning was that we've seen a lot of these programs that start where companies may be managing sustainability in a separate function, but more and more we're seeing those become more integrated, and particularly at smaller companies. I have a client, for example, that their chief risk officer took over the sustainability management activities, and that's been able to help them align all these activities and make sure they're thinking about things from a business perspective, and identify opportunities they have and how they create their products, and design them for low carbon economy, climate resilience, all these different issues.
So Margaret,
Bob, I'll let you add here.
You introduced a new term a while back. I want to go back to you. Talked about something called the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. So again, to confuse everybody with the acronyms, this is a set of 17 goals that the United Nations came up with a number of years ago. They end up tying to the Paris Accord. So if you will Google UN Sustainable Development Goals, you should see a really nice set of icons. There's 17 of these sustainable development goals. And one of the views is this is the broadest sort of landscape of sustainability issues. So again, in reporting, and again with this alphabet soup we have, many companies actually start with those 17 SDGs, then from there figure out which of those apply to them, then figure out which of those are material to then actually help them determine what they should report and accordingly what framework they might use. So again, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is just something you can look up. And all I would just say, Margaret, is the COSO document you have here is worth a look for everybody. It's free. We were very lucky to have the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation pay for the complete development of the material. Gordon Moore was one of the founders of Intel, and his foundation with his wife is very oriented to sustainability. So take a look at it. It'll give you some thoughts. And what I think one of the things you're seeing too is, again, in more mature ESG reporting under the governance section of the company, you're seeing some discussion about how the company uses their ERM program to address these ESG risks.
Yeah, and I think as we move on to the next section, you know, we a lot of times, and this is, you know, our own fault sometimes, when we start thinking about ESG risk, whether it's because E is first or whatever, you know, we saw pictures of floods and we talk about climate risk. There's the social side of risk. There's the risk in your supply chain. There's the risk of human rights violations. There's the risk of not being diverse. You know, all these other social types of risks that should be considered as well. And just don't want to lose sight of that. So Margaret, if you want to.
Yeah, we do have a question here in the chat about examples where companies are investing in climate-related business opportunities. I know for the ones that are coming to mind for me, I've definitely seen, I have a client that's a supplier of an auto manufacturer, and they're looking to really invest in the technology that is needed going forward to move toward electric vehicles. And so they've really shifted their manufacturing and supply chain. I have another client who is in the food and beverage industry, and they continue to look at more efficient ways to source both the containers they're using, but also the recycled content, and more ways to increase recycled content in their processes, which are more efficient. So it reduces the energy use in those as well. I don't know, John, if you have other examples that might be relevant to this group.
Yeah, there are actually a lot of examples, and maybe then touch on them specifically. A good way to try to look for some examples. A lot of companies are actually using green bonds to actually finance some of this CapEx to develop their own business opportunities, or for R&D, or to enhance products, etc., to meet climate-related business opportunities. So, we have a host of clients we work with who are issuing green bonds for different purposes. And if you were to Google, green bonds, and you'll come up with companies that have their green bond report. You can jump into those reports, and usually they list what are the eligibility criteria for different projects that could be financed through the funds from the bond. So, and they'll have different categories, and whether it's R&D and energy efficiency, or use of recycled content and things of that nature. So it's a good way to kind of get ideas for projects, or at least to understand what companies are doing in this space.
Yeah, John, maybe a couple other examples here. Obviously, the whole renewable energy segment as to how you produce that energy, because that becomes a big metric for a lot of organizations. The whole water issue, water filtration systems that create the same product using less water. There's a big issue right now on single-use plastics. So many organizations now are developing plastics and packaging that come from non-fossil fuels. So they're creating plastic-like materials that are coming from plants. And then, the Impossible Whopper is another example, what we call alternative meat and dairy. The notion that those products are more sustainable because they create less methane, et cetera. So it's a really great question. And again, we can look at the woe is me, look at the risks and everything I have to report, but you can also look at it as a business opportunity. So yeah, there are many opportunities here to come up with new ideas that support this whole notion of sustainability, ESG, et cetera.
And Bob, that example you gave of the Impossible Whopper, years ago, this is going back maybe 15 years or so, I was involved in a project with the Institute for the Future, and we were thinking about what things may look like and impact on different stakeholders. And I remember one of the charts or tables we pulled together had lab-grown meat. And at that point in time, I was like, what is this? What does this even mean? But there was a need, right, to say what is more sustainable. Growing a pound of beef takes so much water and energies. If you think about the full life cycle of growing all the grain and feeding and watering the beef, and then taking it to market and butchering it and getting it to your stove, if you will, or your grill, and then there's lab grown meat, right, which cuts to the chase. And I've had Impossible burgers, and I think they're delicious. Not that that's an endorsement, but you can also look, and we see some venture capital firms who are, investing in these types of businesses, whether it's non-dairy cheese, stuff like that it's not only fits a niche market, or what used to be a niche market, but it's actually a sustainable way of getting products to market that are still healthy and useful for the commons, if you will. So, Margaret, maybe, I know we got another question here, and I know we've got, I think, about 10 minutes left, so we may not get through all of our content, but we're certainly happy to continue to answer questions. So please keep the questions coming in. And Margaret, maybe we can go to our polling question we have around some of the developments in the reporting.
Okay, so you can log back, and we'll go to the next question here. So does your company currently report using any of the following standards, frameworks, or guidance? We gave you a number of options because there are so many. Some are not listed here, but you can select more than one.
All right. So that's, you know, there may be maybe folks aren't all responding. There we go. So we've got a good mix. And I think, you know, with a high percentage of not currently reporting, I think this next slide will definitely help. Oh, there we go. I'd like to see a little SASB in there. I think the next slide will kind of help sort out a bit of, you know, the alphabet soup. So Margaret, you know, in the interest of time, maybe we push on to, you know, the evolution or landscape. So there are over 300 regulations, frameworks, standard setting bodies, etc. We've mentioned a handful of them throughout this discussion today. We mentioned the Global Reporting Initiative. We mentioned green bonds. We mentioned TCFD. We mentioned the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SASB, etc. The good thing is many of these things work together. The better thing is many of these organizations that are leading the pack, like the SASB and the GRI and TCFD, are coming together. And I'll let Bob speak about that a bit more. But if you were going to take away anything, especially if we have a large group of non-reporters, to give you the high-level overview. If we think about the Global Reporting Initiative, as Bob mentioned, that's a set of metrics and standards that are developed to appease or to provide transparency and information to a broad base of stakeholders, everyone, employees, customers, communities in which you do business, supply chain, NGOs, investors. If we think about SASB, more laser focused on providing decision useful information to investors based on what's material to your sector. Both super helpful, both serve their purpose. And then I want to talk a bit about TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures. The key thing to remember here is between SASB and TCFD, those I would say are probably largest drivers in the market right now from investors and asset managers. Investors and asset managers are asking for that information, and the ranking and rating agencies are starting to use that information in scoring, and it also impacts all the other things Bob mentioned as far as whether you're a public or private company, large or small, potential access to capital, loans, attracting talent, etc. But the TCFD's difference between TCFD and SASB and GRI is SASB and GRI have metrics with defined criteria where you can report out on the impacts of your organization. How much electricity you consume, how much water you consume, how much greenhouse gas emissions you produce. The TCFD actually asks you to run analyses, risk analyses, on the impact of climate change on your organization. So you can see how that's very important for somebody to make good decisions about your organization. It's also very important for you to manage your operations. So knowing that we've got about 7 minutes left, I think we can go to the next slide and probably skip the TCFD one, Margaret, which I just did the high level overview there. And maybe we can just quickly jump to the WEF slide. And Bob briefly mentioned this, the World Economic Forum recently released some standards metrics to report a set of metrics across all industries. So it's industry agnostic, where they want all companies to report on the same metrics in their annual report. This was just released a week and a half ago. It remains to be seen the level of uptick. So it's something to keep your eye on, definitely. Once investors start asking for it, or once once ranking rating agencies start to change how they score organizations, and if they start to use WEF type metrics, which are most of them are based on SASB and GRI anyhow, then you'll know it'll grow in importance. Like we've seen this huge uptick in SASB, it's because SASB is sector specific and it's relevant for all these decision makers. That's what's been driving the adoption of SASB. I'll pause there and see if Bob wants to add anything into this broad context of these moving parts.
Yeah, thanks, John. So this WEF report, as we call it, is a very interesting document. I think one of the unique parts about it is it's jointly authored or collectively authored by each of the big four accounting firms. There's an explanation in there how they each have participated, but it's being led by Brian Moynihan, CEO of Bank of America. And this is part of the World Economic Forum and a group within that called the International Business Council, or the IBC. It's about 120 to 140 of the largest companies. So a view here would be that these IBC companies would adopt this. It is kind of a cherry picking of the various alphabet soup frameworks that are out there. John mentioned it's industry agnostic, which we could argue about. But again, like the UN SDGs, like these other sets of materials, this is really relevant, super timely information. And, you know, there's a view here that if enough companies follow this, it may become the way to go. I think the confusion here is, so does this mean you have one standard setter? And is it the accounting firms or the WEF, or do you have an independent standard setter? What happens to the alphabet soup organizations? Do they go away? You know, do they all merge? So those aren't bad questions. Those are just questions we need to think about. But again, there is some confusion. And just to cut to the chase, the other organizations like SASB and GRI and the Climate Disclosure Project, et cetera, have all kind of more or less convened and said, let's take all of our standards and lay them out and figure out where are they complementary, where do they overlap, how can we create a common vocabulary, et cetera. So that's also in the works. And I think there's kind of a recognition between this report and those other organizations mutually that it's a good idea to begin to work together on this as one.
Thanks, Bob. And we do only have 3 minutes left. So Bob and Margaret, I think what I'll do is I'll just ask you guys, maybe you can frame up some closing remarks. And I'll just say, from my perspective, is even if you are just beginning or not reporting or somewhere along the journey, there's definitely signs in the marketplace to take a look at what you're reporting, your governance structure in place, and how it impacts the risk to your organization, but also the value you can create. So, you know, check out, we'll work on getting these materials out, but reach out to us if you have questions, and then also check some of the resources that we've mentioned throughout the discussion today. So Bob, if there's anything you want to add in closing, and then Margaret, I'll ask you.
Sure. I just encourage you to go to the sources like SASB and GRI. Also, you know, if you take a leading company that you admire, a large company, they likely have an ESG report, you know, call up a few of those and see what they do and look at how they're organized and what they do report on. And just for all of you, let me just give you a little sense of activities you might think about. You know, first of all, you've got to start the discussion. If you haven't started the discussion, start it internally with you as the management of the company. Get the board engaged, and at some point designate somebody that's a leader that can be responsible for this. You know, begin to figure out what is your strategy and objectives. You know, what do you want to do with this topic? Is it for investors? Is it for employees? Who are your stakeholders and how do they matter? And do you know what they care about? After you do that, so which of all those items are material? And then you can figure out, so therefore, what framework might we use or not use? Then, of course, figure out your reporting process. At some point, you've got to get forward looking, not backwards looking, and set some goals and targets. And then, you know, at the end of the day, get this integrated into your business. This can't be some function on the side. And the companies that have been valued more highly and I think have been more successful have seen this as an opportunity to take these factors and build them into their business. And by doing that, actually create a better company.
Yeah, and
Margaret,
the last thing I'll just add is I think you'll hear and you'll see the more you explore this space that the people who are typically involved in sustainability are really interested in it and often passionate about it. So if you're new to this subject matter and you want to learn more, there's tons of resources out there, but there's usually a lot of people as well who are interested in talking about these topics. So you're never alone. And so you can always reach out and ask questions, look for resources. People are typically very open in talking about sustainability topics and how they might apply to your organization.
Thanks, Margaret. And Don, I don't know if you wanted to have any closing remarks.
Yeah, I just wanted to first thank the three of you for leading today's session. Appreciate you guys taking the time to do that. And special thanks to all the attendees. Hopefully we were able to answer some of your questions, and we're certainly available to take those questions. We'll make sure we get these materials out to the participants. And please don't hesitate to reach out to this group. We'll be responsive, and we want to really help these initiatives and be supportive to companies work on this journey. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to Jasmine for facilitating.
Thank you.
Oh, you're on.
Jasmine, you're on mute.
We lost Jasmine, but have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.